Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. We have an incredible show tonight. I have a dear friend on, Giovanna Peebles, who is, I have to look up the old titles, a archaeologist and a anthropologist, and used to be the state archaeologist, and which is where I met Giovanna first. I was in transportation, and you couldn't do much without her saying it was okay to move the soil. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Pat, for having me. But yeah, it's been a while since I've been on the program. But
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Shame on me, because you've got a lot of stuff. We are going to talk about an issue that I've covered a couple of times on the show with Don Stevens, who is chair of the Mohegan. And then I started talking about this with Giovanna and didn't realize how much passion and how much research and how much work she has done about the, God, I was going to say Odanak, but that's wrong. Abenaki here in Vermont, and the turmoil that's being caused by the Canadian Odanak. So why don't you introduce yourself first to folks?
So I'm an Italian. I'm a native Italian, so I will never be a native Vermonter or a Native American.
That's it. Born here, or?
No, I was born in Italy.
Ah.
I came when I was 6, but we moved. We had a house in Danville, Vermont, starting when we were I was in third grade, and in 8th grade we moved to South Burlington. So because my mom took a job at the University of Vermont.
Oh.
So I attended South Burlington High School. I went to Cornell University for an undergraduate in anthropology and with a concentration in archaeology. Right. Then I went to Idaho State University for a 2-year master's in cultural resources management. And the day I finished my thesis, I flew to Vermont to interview for the job of the first state archaeologist.
Oh, excellent.
And that was in May 1976. So I interviewed all day long, starting with the historic preservation team in Montpelier, and they sent me up to the university to talk to the legendary anthropologist there, Dr. William Haviland, who I actually had met years earlier. And they hired me that night. They said, we want you to come back to Vermont from Idaho and be our first state archaeologist.
Great.
So that was July 1976, just to finish my education, which was very much on-the-job learning. I think there was a whole generation of us who really experienced that on-the-job learning in the 70s and 80s. But when I was 58 years old, I applied to the University of Massachusetts Amherst for a PhD program. And they accepted me, and I spent 2 years, 1 day a week. I would take Thursdays off, go down, and I learned so much in those 2 years, because when you're doing archaeology and doing public archaeology, you don't have a lot of time to read. So there was 30 years worth of literature that I caught up on. Anyway, and then when I retired in 2014, after 38 years as state archaeologist,
I was going to say, I've known you've been there a long time, because that's when I met you in the 90s.
Almost 40 years.
Yeah.
And I just gave up the PhD program and said I'd learned everything I need, and it's time to retire with my husband and have a good time.
There you go.
So that's
great.
That's my quick story.
So well, you were wonderful. I mean, we worked really well together to try to have a connection with the rest, A&R and all the others that get involved in anytime AOT tries to look at ground and dig it up.
So I think that was one of the most important skill sets I had, was forging partnerships. So not confrontational, but there were federal laws that the agencies had to follow, like your agency, that required consideration of historic and archaeological resources. There were state laws. Nobody knew anything about anything. So we were just in from the ground floor.
Right.
So the way it worked best was by forging partnerships And that was how I started working with the Vermont Abenaki, because it became very clear that a large part of our work, my work as state archaeologist, and the work of those consultants, say, that you were hiring at the Agency of Transportation, we were discovering one pre-contact native site after another, one after another, one after another, hundreds and hundreds upon Native American sites. And I think when I started in '76, there were maybe several hundred Native American sites in the archaeological inventory.
Wow.
And now we might be at 3,500 or more.
What would define site? Are we talking something
So
small or little, or something, expansive?
So before I go into these details, I want to make a couple really important points that relate to the reason why we're here tonight.
Right.
And perhaps one of two most important points is that the history of the Native American people in northern New England and in Vermont is so complex, so long, and it is being dismissed by the Odanak and their historian allies basically in 30-second sound bites. This history is poorly known by most people, and it is a history that needs to be, we need to remind people of probably what they never knew. We need to remind people that 12,600 years ago, Vermont people came into what's called Vermont. So the first thing I want to remind people of is the complexity of the history. It's just far more messy and complicated and difficult to untangle properly than one can imagine. And the second point is that from the very beginning of Native occupation in Vermont, 12,600 years ago, movement of people has been paramount.
Right.
That's what people did. People moved to obtain resources. People moved according to season. People moved because of climate change. People moved, but always within certain areas, so that you're seeing watersheds very much becoming homelands. So Winooski River, Missisquoi River, Otter Creek, the Connecticut River, and the same New Hampshire, and the same in Maine.
Right.
There were no boundaries. There were no boundaries until, 1783, you have finally the main boundary between Canada and what was becoming the United States. So that's 1783. In Maine, the boundary didn't even happen until, 1840 something. So there was no boundaries. So people would come and go, and it wasn't about Vermont or Quebec. It was about resources, time of year, and I'm talking thousands of years. But then this movement of people, always within home areas, and we have, and I want to get back to Missisquoi and the thousands upon thousands of years of occupation up in Swanton on the Missisquoi River. I want to get back to that. Don't let me forget that. But what happened is that, and this is a story very special to northeastern North America that wasn't happening out west. When I did my master's work in Pocatello, Idaho, there were Shoshone Indians who had never met Europeans till 1840. So we're talking about communities that had stayed together, that were doing their thing till the very recent time. But in northern New England, which didn't exist, remember that, basically Quebec, the Maritimes, Maine, this whole area, the Basque whalers were in Red Bay, Labrador in, 1510, 1520. Jacques Cartier, 1530s, coming up St. Lawrence with his voyages. There was incredible commerce between Europe and the Atlantic coast. People fishing, people would pay money. I'm going to get on your boat and go with you across the ocean. And this would be like, I don't know, like 1580s. We're talking a very long time ago. So what happened very early on is that there was this, this dynamite of European transactions, European desire for land, European desire for resources like beaver pelts, European desires for timber, wood, and European diseases arrived with them.
Right.
So I looked it up because I wanted to refresh myself of the dates, and between, I don't know, 1616 and 1620, there's speculation that as much as 90% of the Indians along the Maine coast and the Canadian coast to the north, 90% died.
Whoa, that's
in
staggering.
A period of like,
from
10,
our
50,
from our diseases.
From our European
Wonderful.
diseases. But what we do know is that even though the diseases maybe were concentrated along the coast, people were constantly in touch with each other. You know, we had maple syrup here, and maybe you had, I don't know, you had cod on the coast. So, or you had something that the indigenous people in what's now called Vermont needed from friends over that way. And so people were always exchanging goods, and we've been doing this for almost 13,000 years. For 13,000 years, people have been moving hundreds of miles to get stone for their tool making. And people in the interior, which I would call Western Maine, where we have our camp over in Rangeley, New Hampshire, Vermont, the interior, people were still dying from second degree, third degree contact. So you didn't have to be touching a European to get sick, okay? Because those native people could possibly be passing on. And we've heard about we've seen this, we've read this, even in New York State, people just hundreds of miles from the closest European dying of disease. So the reason why I'm setting this stage is that historically, in pre-contact times, people were moving for resources, for mates. So people have always looked for marriage mates. If you live in a community of 50, 60, 100 people, or even 300 people, you reach a point where you're only marrying your first cousin. That's not working.
That's not good.
That's not working.
Right.
So it happened in prehistory, in the pre-contact era, and it continued to happen. And it happened in French Canada. It happened in the Odanak communities. It happened in everywhere that people had to move to find partners in prehistory, and it continued to this day. Anyway, so 2 important points. Complexity of the historic topic, super complicated, so many wars, so many movements of people. Refugee communities came and went, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute in terms of the origins of Odanak. And then people came back. I mean, there's a presumption that people went to Odanak. Every single Vermont native, every single New Hampshire native, all kinds of communities from Maine, they all went to Odanak and never came back. And that's not how, as anthropologists, we know that's not true. I go back to Italy. My mom went back to Italy twice a year to see her mom and her aunties. And I would go with her when I was a kid. And now I've been going back because what? Because I'm Italian.
Right.
And the Scottish, I mean, Colin Calloway has written extensively. I mean, this is well known. Just because you leave Scotland doesn't make you less Scottish. Right. Okay.
That's right.
And look at the Irish in Boston. I mean, this is human behavior. Right. So, so those are the important points: mobility, people moving, and I don't know.
And I think
go ahead.
as you've been talking about the Odanak, and they are up in Canada, and I just wanted to clarify that because
well, let me set the stage a little.
We've thrown these things out.
Yeah, so let me set the stage a little.
Please.
So Please, everyone, remember, I'm not Native American, and I am here in support of, and I'm here with the Vermont Abenaki. I am not, but I'm not Native American, let's be very clear. And I have lots of areas of expertise, and I have lots of areas that I'm not an expert. I'm very well read, but I'm not an expert. In fact, I'm probably not an expert in most things, but I'm better read than most people.
Right.
Okay, so that'll give me, ahead of the class a little bit.
Well, please, I'm supportive of the Abenaki here, so I don't know what that
So
means.
so the Abenaki, so the Odanak. So I have never been to the village of Odanak, and and I'm sorry about that because I've really, really been wanting to go up. I know they have a wonderful museum. So the village of Odanak was created as a Jesuit mission, and it was moved several times. It's on the St. Francis River. If you're in Newport, Vermont, and head north, and then a little bit to the northwest, you will encounter the village of Odanak. It used to be, in historic records, it was called the St. Francis Village for the St. Francis Mission. And what I do know, and I know this from Gordon Day. So Gordon Day was a prince of a man. He was an extraordinary scholar. And I became dear friends with him, even though he'd be 100 now, and I'm just 74 today. I once ran into him, David, the kids and I were camping at Groton State Park, and there he was with his family and his boys. And we, the usual Vermont story, you run into someone.
Yep.
So Gordon Day is the foremost ethnologist of the Western Abenaki in the world. And he wrote dozens and dozens of articles. But this one publication called The History of the Odanak, or The History of St. Francis Village, was my Bible on the subject. And I read it very carefully last winter. I glanced at it in the last week. What we know about the village of Odanak, it was a refugee community. And refugees, in the traditional way, like you have refugees from any war, starting in like the 1660s, where this one southern Connecticut River community, these Sokoke people, possibly from, I think they were Squawkees from the Northampton, Massachusetts area. They were the primary community, so we're talking Massachusetts Native people were sort of on the Vermont border, up in Odanak in 1660. Over the next 20 years, we're talking at least 15 different Native communities from southern Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont all went to Odanak as refugees. And Gordon Day knows this from oral histories, from interviewing the elders for 50 years, from place names, and from doing the most exhaustive research. If you're not a serious historian, you're not going to enjoy this book, because it's the kind of thing that turned me off to history, actually, when I was a kid. There's like so many dates. You really need a spreadsheet to keep so much of this organized. But the bottom line is that Odanak is was historically an amalgamation of many different Native communities. And one big feeder to Odanak was the Missisquoi village in Swanton. So we have archaeological sites in Swanton going back 9,200 years ago. And it was a transportation project, actually.
There you go.
It was a transportation project. There's that bridge right south of the village of Swanton, and we needed to, I think we needed to expand the bridge, and the University of Vermont Consulting Archaeology program did one of these very early projects there.
Yep.
And because there was going to be a lot of disturbance, a lot of impacts to this area, and the preliminary test units discovered, and you go back to what's a site,
Right.
discovered pre-contact stone tools, chips in the test pits, and they were very deep down in the test pits. And then because the transportation agency was going to destroy much of this landform, the University of Vermont, and Peter Thomas, a dear friend, was the director there for 20-some years. They had to excavate big areas and found this 9,200-year-old site, which completely blew us away because this was 1979, and we were just starting to understand how intensive the Indian occupation of Vermont was. Deep time and intensive. Basically, where you look, you will find.
Wow.
And the only reason you're not finding sites in the Montpelier area when you walk a field is because they're 8 feet down.
Right.
Because of all the flood deposition. But in the fields of Addison County, in the 1820s, the history of Burlington, every field was full of chips, spear points, arrow points.
Cool.
And so that is how one recognizes a site, either on the surface or through test pits. So Swanton has this deep, deep Indian occupation. Peter Thomas did a great deal of archaeological work there because at one point the Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge needed to do some kind of bank stabilization. He found 1.5 miles of continuous occupation on the north side of the Missisquoi River. And Peter was working with Blackie Lampman, who was the chief at the time. This was pre-Homer even. And with the Abenaki community. And then we were doing, Highgate Falls. There was this, let's increase the height of the dam and let's flood hundreds of acres. More archaeology there.
Right.
And the entire Abenaki community not the entire, but Peter Thomas hired a number of Abenaki community members. So we were talking, in the 70s, Peter was already doing archaeology in Swanton and Highgate with Abenaki people.
And you mentioned in Swanton the how old the site was.
Yes.
What determines that? I know you know all these. What do you look at to determine that it's
this was
as old as
interesting.
it was?
In this particular case, it was the shape of the spear point. So there's car aficionados. They can look at a '67 Mustang. They can look at a car.
My
that
husband.
There's a lot of people like
Yes.
that. You can look at a certain car and go, oh yeah, '67 Mustang,
Right, that's
or
him.
whatever, a 71 Chevy,
Right.
and certainly not me. But there are certain types of spear points that are diagnostic. They're just like that. They're just like a '62 Bug. They're with a little tolerance of time. We know that they date to X amount of time, and they were not made before or after.
Interesting.
And then, ideally, though, you'll find some organic materials that you can date using carbon-14 dating, which gives you a lot more accurate dating.
Right.
But by looking at the spear point types, you can say this appears to be early archaic or dating to 8 to 9,000 years ago. So
Cool. Thank you.
so
That's cool.
no, thank you for asking. So my involvement with the Vermont Abenaki started, I would say, like in '85, where the Abenaki community, again in Missisquoi, wanted to repatriate the human remains, their ancestors, that had been sitting at the University of Vermont since 1973.
Oh.
3 years before I took the job as state archaeologist, there was a family building a home in Highgate, right on the border of Swanton. And they tragically, or I think it was, are they building a swimming pool or a house? Tragically, they hit a burial ground. And by a fluke, the University of Vermont was holding a conference that weekend. And so 30 archaeologists arrived on the
job
scene
training.
and recovered the human remains.
Wow.
And the materials associated with these ancestors. And this site dates from 2,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago. And it was an extraordinary site because the materials that the Abenaki ancestors were buried with, such as copper, preserved a lot of the organic material. And it just showed the most extraordinary relationships among peoples to the west and to the southeast, just the trade networks. So back to the Abenaki, Homer said, we want our people, we want our ancestors back in the ground.
Right. So, if for those of you who don't remember, Homer was the chief of the
Missisquoi, with the St. Francis Sokoke band.
Right, and he was that for a long time.
He was the right chief at the right time.
Yeah.
So I do want to address one thing that the Odanak community has touched on. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was this activism, this renewed activism by African Americans, the American black community, by Native Americans, and by people with disabilities. It all fed on each other. They said, if these guys can do it, we can do it too. So people, Native communities, marginalized communities that had been biding their time, all of a sudden said, that's it.
It's time. Huh?
We're stepping up.
Right.
And there's been a lot of criticism saying, well, the Odanaks don't hide in place. Why were the Missisquoi, why are the Vermont Indians hiding in place? Well, the Odanak community didn't have to hide in place because, one, they are in a reserve area. They are a federally recognized First Nation. I don't exactly know when that happened, but maybe it happened from 1660 onward. They didn't have to hide in place. In fact, they didn't want to hide because they were they were among the finest basket makers in the northeastern North America. And to sell their remarkable baskets, they needed to say, I am Indian.
Right.
They needed to go to the Maine coast, to the New Hampshire coast, to the Lake Champlain, to the resort areas in New Hampshire and elsewhere. So starting from, I don't know, the 1870s, they had to advertise, I'm Native American, I'm Indian, because I want to buy your basket because you are Indian.
Right, right.
The Vermont communities that's not what was happening here. These people had been, many of them, just like an Odanak, had intermarried with French Canadians, and we're talking generations of intermarrying, okay? There's no community in the northeastern United States that's pure Native. It can't be, because you can't be marrying all your first cousins. I mean, that would have happened.
Right.
That would have happened generations ago. People have to marry outside of their own communities. Maybe you can marry other Native Americans. If you're Passamaquoddy, maybe you'd marry a Penobscot. And certainly in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, you had Saco Indian from New Hampshire marrying Sokoke from, the Connecticut River.
Right.
I mean, this kind of stuff was happening all the time. But the Vermont Indians were living very differently. They were marginalized because even if they had taken French Canadian names, even if in the baptismal records early on, somebody had said, oh, I don't like your Indian name, I'm going to give you the name Jean-Louis, okay? They were living in a very marginalized, impoverished, not just impoverished, they were the lowest of the low. People did not like French Canadians. They were the laborers. They certainly didn't like Native people. Why should they advertise themselves when they couldn't even vote? Calvin Coolidge gave the American Indian the right to vote in the 1920s sometime, I think 1924. So why should they advertise themselves as Indian? I mean, so once there was a border between Vermont and Canada, things became really different. The Odanak were in a reserve. They were marginalized. Yes, they suffered greatly. They were sent to away from home. You know this whole story, right, Pat?
Yeah, I do.
And so I am not undermining the pain that the Odanak, Abenaki have suffered. Okay, this is not what I'm trying to do. But I don't want to minimize what the Vermont Abenaki were experiencing, which was very different than what the Canadian Abenakis were experiencing. So in terms of the archaeology, the native people of Vermont have, Missisquoi and everywhere else, they have been here for thousands of years. When people go to Odanak because of a war situation, because of one of the French and Indian wars, they go up there.
Yep.
But then they will come back because this is a pattern they've had for thousands and thousands of years. They will come home.
How late in this progression did the other three tribes come to be? Because it's not just the Missisquoi here in Vermont that we're dealing with now.
So I'm really glad you're bringing this up. Missisquoi, because of Homer, had the loudest voice. Missisquoi they were the only one of the four tribes that tried to get federal recognition. Early on, they submitted, like 1976, they submitted a petition to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then they withdrew it. And then they resubmitted it. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is doing everything possible to make sure that tribes are not federally recognized, because federal recognition is really scary. Yeah. Because if you're federally recognized, you're a sovereign nation, which means you're treated very differently.
Right.
It's not like being a village. It's not like being a municipality. And so they're organized so as to put one barrier in front of another for tribes not to be federally recognized. When the state of Vermont, this is such a complicated story, and the problem with doing this in a short period of time, because we could say, okay, we're going to spend half an hour on this topic, half an hour on this topic, and then we'll get experts who really can speak about some of these things better. But I lived through all these governors. Howard Dean was terrified of gambling. Okay? So let me start at the beginning. In 1976, the year I started as state archaeologist, Tom Salmon, who you know and love well,
Yes, well.
He, right before he left, because in November of 76, he ran his term out, and Dick Snelling was elected governor.
Snelling for one, right?
Snelling won.
Right.
Tom Salmon issued an executive order, November of 1976, recognizing the Vermont Abenaki. The very first executive order, among the first that Dick Snelling did in January of 77, was pull that state recognition. Because once you start talking to other governors, you understand what it means that, oh my God, there could be gambling. Oh my goodness, there could be this, there could be that. It's very scary to consider. Maybe they want land.
I was going to say land grab.
Maybe they want money.
Right.
The state of Maine, the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy, had put in for land claims in, I think it was 1979. And so there was a lot of political knowledge amongst politicians that this was scary stuff. And it has nothing to do with the Vermont native story, but I mean with the contemporary, with what's going on now. But the Maine Indians have suffered mightily for many reasons, and that's a whole other hour. So then what happened was that in 2002, or maybe even the year before, Howard Dean tells Attorney General Bill Sorrell, we're going to do everything possible to make sure these guys are not federally recognized. And so they hired and spent $100,000, is my understanding, to do a report using the 7 federal criteria and going boom, 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 all the reasons why the Vermont, the Missisquoi Abenaki did not meet the federal criteria. And the Odanak community is using this 2002 report as fodder, as does public radio, as does Vermont Public, Vermont Digger. The media love this. Quick soundbite. Right. That Attorney General says they're not Indian. Well, the Vermont Attorney General, for that 2002 report, could not find a single scholar who really knew the history and the archaeology and the anthropology of the Missisquoi and the Vermont Native people to participate in this. It was very similar to what Odanak is doing. They're using European conventions. We look at the census records, no mention of Indians here. We look at birth records. We're looking at different, whatever records were available. No mention of Indians. Nope, everybody's W for white, or they don't exist at all, or they don't exist. And we know that until 1870, the United States Census didn't even include Indians. They included, there was no consideration for Native people. In fact, I had a really interesting, I had a really good time looking at the United States Census has hundreds of pages on Native people in the census records. And in the 1860 census report for Vermont, one Indian reported for Vermont in 1860. 5 in the state of Maine. So in 1860, the United States Census, there were 5 Indians in the state of Maine. Right. So that is just a gross example of the fact that the people creating these records were biased, didn't want to do it right, didn't know how to do it right, I didn't like how you pronounce your native name, I'm just going to give you the name Smith. I mean, how many Italians come through Ellis Island with the name Morselli? Right. Nope, you're not Morse. Your new name is Morse. Right. And this happened continually, okay? So, and I do want to get back to LaRue's genealogy at one point, because I did study carefully one of the chiefs that there's a 700 and some page genealogy report that was just published 2 weeks ago. And it's horrible. It is insulting. It is unethical. Oh. We'll get back to that in a minute. Yeah, but I want to respond to what you're saying. So what happened was that the 2002 Attorney General report says these guys aren't real. Well, you only meet possibly 3 of the 7 criteria. And then the Bureau of Indian Affairs basically takes the Vermont Attorney General's report and uses all their data and all their research. And finally, in 2007 or 8, a few years later, says, nope, you don't meet all the criteria. You only meet 3 out of the 7. So we're not going to recognize you. End of story. So because of that, the Missisquoi banned, and at which point the other communities were really doing work in their own communities. They were starting to, they'd always been there. Yep, but they'd always been there. When I go to Bellows Falls, when I was years ago, decades ago, I'd be in Bellows Falls and I would talk to Native people down there, Elnu community members. The Elnu. When I was up in the Northeast Kingdom, there were Nulhegan people. They worked hard to protect the Brunswick Springs site. So in terms of land protection, the Native people have been working behind the scene, and I'm talking about all 4 communities for a very long time. So the Native people of Vermont said, forget the what do you call it, the federal recognition. So then they went to the courts, and Judge Wolchik, in a very famous 1989 decision, said, of course you're all Indian. And it was an extraordinary 90-page decision. Wow. And Gordon Day testified extensively with hundreds of pages of testimony. Colin Calloway, who's the foremost historian of Native history, professor and chair of the Native American program at Dartmouth College for many years, and just an extraordinary scholar. He participated and testified in the Wolchik fish-in case. And Bill Haviland, anthropologist at UVM, I was not allowed, I couldn't participate because I work for the state of Vermont. So the state of Vermont was not going to be participating, right? So anyway, so that Judge Wolchik writes this 90-page decision saying, of course, these people are allowed to fish and hunt because they never ceded their Aboriginal rights, and they've been here from the beginning. And they have all these all these scholars supporting this with hundreds of pages of testimony. which the Odanak conveniently forget as well, and as do all the Vermont media. Then following year, terrified, the state of Vermont asked the Supreme Court to review Wolchik's decision. And in the Vermont Supreme Court, they brought in several people, including my old friend, Judge Al Barney, who owned the house next to us in North Danville, where we had a farm when I was a kid. We'd commute from the New York area after I came from Italy up to Danville, and our neighbors was Judge Al Barney. And Jim Morse, the associate judge for that court, fell in love with American history and wrote this long decision that basically was all about European history, Vermont history. No mention of Indians anywhere in this 20-page decision. And basically said, well, there isn't a single event that extinguished your Aboriginal rights, but all together, all these wars and the what do you call it? The Articles of Confederation. And then we had the Republic of Vermont,
right.
and the New Hampshire grants. All these different things, they just kind of come together and extinguished your Aboriginal rights. Sorry, this is the Vermont Supreme Court decision.
Right. Wonderful.
So it was unbelievable. But reading it, I just read it this afternoon because I had to. That's why I have such a good memory, a clear memory of it. There are lawyers all over the United States that teach this in their law class about what not to do and how bad legal precedent is created. So anybody looking at that decision is probably barking up the wrong tree, because that was just that's just horrific. So then after that, they said, well, let's go to the state of Vermont. So the judicial threw them out. So let's
threw who out?
The Missisquoi Abenaki, the fishing case. You're not Aboriginal. You don't exist. Go away. So then at that point, he started working with the Vermont legislature. And in the meanwhile, in 1983, Dick Snelling came all the way, did a 180 and said, through this executive order, I'm proclaiming you to be Native American. So he did that. Good. So in 77, he said, no, you're not. In 83, yes, you are. And then, but all along, the part that is just not recognized is all for the communities have done such incredible work within their communities.
Right.
The earliest affordable housing in Vermont was in the 1970s in Swanton, sponsored, advocated for by the Vermont Abenakis. And community food banks, taking care of elders, taking care of land. So that's what these 4 tribes have been doing. 2 tribes were recognized in 2011, and 2 tribes were recognized in 2012. Exactly. And so we have 4 state-recognized tribes. I learned the other day that there's 15 states that have no federally recognized tribes. So we're one of 15 states. 12 or 15. Anyway, somewhere between 12 and 15 states have no federally recognized tribes.
What makes our Abenaki and the Odanak, they're all Abenaki, correct?
They're all
Abenaki.
They all speak Western Abenaki. Yes.
And so
it's all they're intermarried.
Yeah, right.
They were all
so
cousins.
It's a big,
in the 1970s, Chief Walter Watsow was very close with the Missisquoi community. In the federal petition, in the fishing, litigation in 1980s, the Odanak completely supported the Missisquoi Abenaki. And then they didn't. And then all of a sudden something happened, we still don't exactly know why the Odanak Abenaki are using the same tactics against the Vermont Abenaki that the European powers and the moneyed Europeans used against them.
Right.
It is exactly the same.
Looking at the clock, we have about 12 minutes left in this segment. Could you?
I do want to talk about the LaRue genealogy just for a minute.
All right, but I want to make sure that at the end of this, we know what the Odanak are trying to do and what impact it's got here in Vermont and
Yeah.
where we are in that, so that it's kind of
Come together.
come
Yeah.
together. That'd be
So,
great.
just in the last 2 weeks, this Daryl LaRue, who's a genealogist funded by, he's a Canadian genealogist. I don't know if he's a genealogist. I don't know if he's a genealogist. I do know that the work he does violates the ethics of this one organization called in fact, I brought it here on purpose. It's called the Board for Certification of Genealogists. And it is a national and international organization of genealogists. And they have code of ethics. And the first code of ethics is I will identify my sources for all information. So that 700 and some page report that was just published.
And those sources?
Well, there's a paragraph saying we use this, and it's all publicly available, but it lists every single name. So I just looked for a couple of hours at Chief Brenda Gagne's genealogy that this group published, or LaRue published on behalf of the Odanak. One of the ethical standards is I will not publish any personal or genealogical information unless I have informed consent from that person.
Huh.
So I'm pretty sure they did not ask Brenda Gagne, Shirley Hook, Marjory Bruchak, Don Stevens, and I don't know who I think
These
there
are
was a
the
fifth person.
chairs of the groups.
These are the people
right.
these are the chiefs
Yep.
of not Marge Bruchak. She is a very well-known anthropologist,
Right.
scholar, PhD anthropologist, who is Abenaki. And they are vilifying her along with the Vermont chiefs. So she's included in, I think, the 4 or 5 people in the 750-page report. And what LaRue does is he gives one name after another. He goes back 15 generations. And just for Chief Brenda Gagne, who is the chief of Missisquoi, of the St. Francis Sokoke Band and Missisquoi, he lists, this is pretty crazy, 1,642 people. And it's this fire hose of names, birth date, and born this date in this town, and dies in this date, and it gives the ethnicity, French. And it continues, generation after generation after generation. Not a single source.
Wow.
Not a single, it doesn't say where that particular genealogical, of this 1,642, there isn't a single source for not a one of those.
And they're taking this as gospel?
That is the issue. Thank you,
Wow.
Pat. They are falling on their sword on bad, unethical genealogy, where names were changed continually.
Wow.
Ask any indigenous person. Ask the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy. Ask any indigenous person. How should we treat European records? Should we take them as gospel? Hardly. And this is what the Odanak are doing.
Wow.
Absolutely gospel. But here's the thing. When you look at Brenda Gagne's, Brenda, forgive me for talking without you being here, but what I'm seeing is that so many of Brenda's relatives are Highgate people. They are up in the Quebec area. I'm talking generations and generations
Right.
back, right in the area where the Jesuit missions were, where all the native people were. So even though they're labeled as not being R for red or I for Indian, I don't know what the French version of it is. And in the baptismal records, because of course Catholics in France had all the baptismal records.
Right.
And Odanak, as a Jesuit mission, had all those records, which most communities certainly don't have.
Right.
But the Jesuits had a reason to give you a Christian name because they wanted to assimilate you. Of course, they're
Right,
not going to
right.
call you a native name.
Right.
They're going to call you Madeleine.
Right.
They're going to call you Anne-Marie. They're going to call you Catherine, after Saint Catherine. Okay, they're going to pick a saint's name
Right.
and give it to you. So what I'm seeing is the geography of so many of these names, 1,642 names listed. And how many pages is it? I don't know, 175 pages. A lot of the places where Brenda's family was from, generations back, were in that general area of Trois-Rivières, up there in the St. Francis and
Right.
St. Lawrence area. It's this geography that's quite circumscribed of many French, many native people from dozens of populations all over Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. So you want us to group it together?
If you could just explain to folks, and we're going to continue this discussion because I think it's important for all of us to protect Vermonters. And they are Vermonters. They are Abenaki Vermonters, are they not?
They are,
They are?
absolutely
Yeah,
that.
and they vote, are they what?
No,
Not.
absolutely, yes,
Oh,
they are
I thought I heard
Vermonters.
not out of there. I went, oh, no.
Yes,
No,
they are
yes,
Vermonters.
And they
They are-
vote?
they
And
are-
they work here?
They work so hard for their communities.
Yeah.
So what's in it for the Odanak? What was really interesting, I was listening to this wonderful podcast that's taught me a lot about Maine, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac history and political history, contemporary history from today up until the 1700s. Molly Abomsawin is one of the guests in one of these podcasts, which I highly recommend. And the series is called Wabanaki Windows. And there's this remarkable Penobscot elder named Donna Loring who hosts these programs once a month, over 140 programs. Molly Abomsawin, who's one of the Odanak activists, a young, very smart, very talented woman, a musician who has won awards. Donna Loring asked her, why are you doing this? Why are you attacking the Vermont Abenaki? Why are you trying to vilify, my words, why are you vilifying them? And Molly Abomsawin says, well, we want to just protect our land. And I burst out laughing when I heard that, when I know the hard work that the Vermont Abenakis have been doing for 50 years. Missisquoi Abenaki were taking care of lands. Elnu Abenakis were taking care of their lands. Cowassuk Abenakis and Nulhegan Abenakis. They have been taking care of their lands for a very long time. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, and I think people need to know they were recognized, all four tribes were recognized by the state of Vermont.
Absolutely.
And they were just granted 300 acres, something incredible, which is wonderful, up by, in the Nulhegan area with Don Stevens.
Nulhegan
And
group.
they're busy stewarding those lands for us, for Vermonters. And it's
And the education they have done.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked with Vermont teachers for almost 40 years, and no one spoke about the Vermont Abenakis. Nobody spoke about the native inhabitants. And the education that the Vermont Abenaki have done in local communities, in local schools, working with the state and other partners
exactly.
is extraordinary.
It's been amazing.
Is extraordinary. And it's because of the Vermont Abenaki that Vermonters know about the indigenous.
And if you want to see something spectacular,
Vermont.
go to the Transportation Center here in Montpelier, and on the wall is this amazing mural.
Mural. That's good
Mural
work.
that 8 Abenaki women did, and it really shows their life and their culture, and it really gives you a sense of the people. Anyway, this is Pat McDonald. We are going to continue this discussion in several other videos because I think personally this is an important discussion that we all should be involved in and should know what's happening to many thousands of our Vermonters. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont. Thank you so much for joining us.
It has
It's
been
great.
my
What knowledge.
incredible pleasure.
I hope you're screaming loud and strong about this. I know you are. You know.
I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and the Vermont Abenaki leadership, they are they're humble. They have been recognized.
Yep.
They have fought so hard
Yep.
for over 40 years. And the fact that they have to fight all over again,
Yes, and
I think it's just not right. It's just not right. So non-Abenaki scholars, we're all going to be doing what we can, obviously.
It upsets me about UVM, about the gentlemen, the folks there that are working with the Odanak. I don't think Vermonters would like to give up their land to the Odanak, just saying.
I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
I can't even imagine it.
The problem is that the historian at UVM, whose expertise seems to be in Hydro-Quebec, I think he's done a lot of work on the history of Hydro-Quebec and the sociology of Hydro-Quebec. He's not doing his students any favor by not giving them, I mean, I brought a whole bag of publications full of yellow stickies, okay, that are available.
Right.
I mean, his students should be reading every one of Gordon Day's
Making up their own
30
minds.
or 40 articles.
Right.
Okay.
Anyway, we've got to close, and I appreciate your watching. Stay tuned for more. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont. Signing off. See you next week.